All right. So I've been asked to speak to you this morning on the topic, how can I be happier? Well, reminds me of a story I once read about a wealthy businessman who was horrified to see a fisherman sitting beside his boat playing with a small child when there were still daylight hours left to be doing fishing. And the businessman said, "Why aren't you out fishing?" "Well, because I caught enough fish for one day," replied the fisherman. "Why don't you catch some more?" said the businessman. "What would I do with them?" asked the fisherman. "Well, you could earn some more money," said the businessman. "Then with the extra money, you could buy a bigger boat, go into deeper waters and catch more fish. Then you would make enough money to buy bigger nets, and with bigger nets, you could catch even more fish and make more money. And with that money, you could own 2 boats, maybe 3 boats. Eventually, you could have a whole fleet of boats and be rich like me." "Then what would I do?" asked the fisherman. "Then," said the businessman, "you can really enjoy life." The fisherman looked at the businessman quizzically and asked, "What do you think I am doing now?" "If I could wave a magic wand and grant you either one of 2 gifts, the first, £1 billion, the second, happiness, but the catch is you can't have both, which would you choose? £1 billion, but you wouldn't be happy, or happiness, but you wouldn't be rich?" No brainer, right? You would pick happiness. Why? Because nearly everyone agrees that happiness is the one thing we all want. We don't say, what good is it to be happy if it doesn't make you rich? But we do say, what good is it to be rich if it doesn't make you happy? According to the ancient philosopher Cicero, the question of happiness was the biggest question in ancient philosophy, which means any world belief worth its salt ought to have something helpful to say about it, including Christianity. Well, let's see if it does. Now, in terms of defining happiness, it's not as easy to do as we might think, because the English word happiness usually means a subjective state of satisfaction. So that in modern English, if you feel happy, you are happy. Ancient understandings of happiness, on the other hand, such as the Greek word eudaimonia, that one's for you, Paul. You're welcome. Usually meant you're happy. Good. Now, the ancient understanding of happiness usually meant not a subjective feeling of happiness, but an objective state of human flourishing, a state of living in accordance with the goal or purpose of a human being. And interestingly, the technical definition of happiness today from a social science perspective tries to capture both a subjective and an objective element to happiness when it defines happiness as a sense of being happy in your life and of being happy with your life. Being happy in your life is about experiencing lots of positive emotions or feelings of happiness like contentment, peace, exhilaration, or awe. And being happy with your life is being satisfied with your life from a more objective standpoint. You think your life is pretty good relative to your vision of what a flourishing human life looks like. So, for example, a mother with a newborn baby might not be experiencing happiness in her life because she is subjectively experiencing feelings of exhaustion and sleep deprivation. But she may still nonetheless be experiencing happiness with her life if being a mother forms part of her vision of what an objectively good life looks like for her. Does that make sense so far? Now, since happiness is a subject that we've been studying as human beings for centuries, which is quite a long time if you think about it, you might expect we would have figured out by now how to find it. Yet how much of our modern life is characterized by dissatisfaction, boredom, stress, frustration, and fatigue? As one very popular blogger aptly summarized it, many of us are spending too much, drinking too much, submitting to anger, eating unhealthy crap, consuming caffeine throughout the day, taking pills to ease the pain, pipelining social media at night while ignoring other people, working too much, and yes, even working out too much. Of course, Russell and I are both guilty of the last one, working out too much, as you can tell. But what is going on? Why does happiness continue to be so elusive? for so many? Well, at least one thing seems clear from the social sciences, and that is that material wealth alone is an insufficient basis for finding happiness. According to research by Angus Deaton, the 2015 Nobel laureate in economics, once your salary is high enough to live reasonably comfortably but not extravagantly, which he defines in the US context as $75,000 US a year, he says any dollar above that amount will not make you any happier. In other words, money alone cannot buy you happiness. It can make you incredibly stressed and anxious if you don't have it, but it can't guarantee happiness if you do have it. At a party given by a billionaire in New York, the writer Kurt Vonnegut turned to his good friend and fellow writer Joseph Heller and informed him that their host had made more money in a single day as a hedge fund manager that Heller had earned from his popular novel Catch-22 over its entire history. Heller's response was brilliant. He said, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Humility." No, I'm just kidding. No, his response was, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough." Enough. Why is it that however much money or wealth we have in life, it seems that it is rarely, if ever, enough? Well, as a psychologist Abraham Maslow identified years ago with his now famous Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're familiar with it, the pyramid. Once you've got your basic material needs for food and shelter and safety met as a human being, it becomes all about meeting the non-material needs we have as well, such as our needs for belonging, acceptance, self-esteem, and self-actualization. If you recall Maslow's 5-stage pyramid, which I just drew before the service started, pretty good if you ask me, it looks something like this. At the bottom, we've got our basic biological and physiological needs, moving up to needs for safety and security, moving up to needs for love and belonging, moving up to needs for self-esteem, based both on our ability to kind of be on top of life a bit, and also based on our recognition from others, our status and prestige that we get, and acceptance from others. And then finally, on the very top of the pyramid, the need for self-actualization, for realizing our personal potential to become everything one is capable of becoming. Now, I happen to think that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is quite a helpful tool for helping us to understand human happiness. For example, take the need for self-actualization at the top of the pyramid, the desire to be the best version of yourself you can possibly be. Well, Maslow's hierarchy of needs tells us that you'll never find happiness just by focusing exclusively on the top of the pyramid, just by focusing exclusively on self-actualization and neglecting the more mundane human needs, such as the need for food or shelter or sleep. In fact, I discovered this hard truth in my 20s. Not long ago now, of course. I was trying to be the best of the best of the best of the best version of me that I could possibly be by trying to cram in too many things in my life to the neglect of sleep. I was working in a prestigious law firm at the time while enrolled in 2 separate postgraduate courses at the same time, both full-time. And embarrassingly, yes, I was stupid. And embarrassingly, I remember thinking how awesome and high capacity I was, that unlike normal human beings, I had successfully pushed through 3 nights in a row without sleep in order to get some high-level projects for work done, as well as a bunch of assignments that were all coalescing of a due date at the same time, until on the 4th morning, as I was driving to work, feeling like a conquering champion, I fell asleep at the wheel, crashed into the gutter, popped the tire on my car, thankfully did not injure anyone except my own pride. And it was for me a real wake-up call that I was not a Superman. And it helped me to realize something very important, which was that if we break the fundamental laws of human nature in our pursuit of happiness, then eventually those laws end up breaking us. Likewise, Maslow's hierarchy of needs remind us that we'll also never find happiness in our lives or with our lives if we neglect our basic need for love and belonging in human relationships. And this is actually backed up by the longest study on human health and happiness ever. which is a study that began more than 80 years ago when researchers at Harvard University began tracking 268 Harvard sophomores through college, graduation, marriage, war, parenthood, life crises, old age, and death, and then subsequent generations and as well. And according to this study, far and away the strongest predictor of a long, healthy, and happy life was not social class, wealth, fame, IQ, or even genetics. It was having close relationships in your life with other people, with community, with family, with friends. And rather soberingly, the studies show that those without close relationships and community often died earlier, prompting the director of the study to conclude that loneliness kills us as powerfully as smoking or alcoholism. It's just as the Bible says in Genesis chapter 2, it is not good for the human being to be alone. And at least part of the reason many are so unhappy today is because even though technology means we're more connected than ever before, we're actually in a crisis of disconnection. There's a lot of loneliness. There's a lot of solitude. And according to New York Times columnist David Brooks, this loneliness has a lot to do with the lie that our culture tells us that if we just succeed in our life, we'll be happy, or we can just make ourselves happy. A lie which Brooks says he believed entirely as a young man, which led him to end up valuing time over people, always busy, always on the move. But what it meant was no one confided in him. All his friends were work friends, weekday friends. He had no weekend friends. And then he says, my marriage ended, my kids left for college, and I was left living in this little apartment, just living for, our marriage is okay, by the way. This has nothing to do with our marriage. Just living for work, lonely, aching with emptiness. And so many people are experiencing that in our lives, in our country today. So if we neglect these basic human needs for food and rest and relationships, we do so at our own peril. Now, according to psychologist Professor Ben Shahar from Harvard, the two main ways that people try to find happiness in the modern world today, beyond their basic needs and into their higher needs for self-fulfillment and actualization, it's either through the pursuit of cultivated pleasure or through the pursuit of achievement, but neither ultimately bring fulfillment. Pleasure alone cannot bring fulfillment, he says, because of the principle of hedonic adaptation, which means that while pleasure might be able to bring us feelings of happiness in the short term, the feelings of happiness that we get from that thing each time becomes less and less over time as we adapt to it or get used to it, sort of like a law of diminishing returns for pleasurable experiences. And the path of hedonism, therefore, leads only two ways, either to addiction, you try to eke out more and more and more from that thing and it's never enough, but you can't give up, or just complete boredom. A sense of meaninglessness that comes not from being weary of pain, but from being weary of pleasure, which is even worse. And achievement alone can't bring fulfillment either, he says, because of the principle of the arrival fallacy, which means we overestimate both the intensity and the duration of happiness that will come when that goal that we're aiming for is achieved, or the thing obtained, whatever that goal might be, getting into that university, getting that job, getting that promotion, getting that house, or that relationship, or that influence, or that celebrity status, so that after a while, we're thinking about getting the next thing we don't have or achieving the next thing we haven't achieved because it's never enough. And so the arrival fallacy continues and continues, keeps you on the rat race treadmill, he says, and the lasting happiness we long for never arrives. And as celebrity stories often demonstrate, even that small percentage of people who do achieve the sort of wealth, fame, popularity, or influence to make them stand out from the crowd, find at the top of the mountain that sort of success alone is unsatisfying, anticlimax. For example, a reporter once asked Elvis Presley the following question: Elvis, when you first started playing music, you said you wanted to be famous, rich, famous, and happy. You're now rich and famous. Are you happy? To which Elvis replied, I am lonely as hell. And that was 6 weeks before he died. Likewise, the actress Nicole Kidman said it wasn't until she eventually won an Oscar for Best Actress that she realized how empty her life really was. So then that raises a huge question. what the heck is lacking here? Because when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it looks like they would have everything. We would assume, provided we're able to meet our basic needs for food and housing and community and people around us, and provided we're able to enjoy pleasurable experiences, and provided we're able to achieve goals that we're proud of and that other people recognize as commendable, and that align with the best vision of ourselves, then we should theoretically be able to find happiness both in our lives and with our lives, especially since we moderns have more opportunities and greater freedom than ever before. Now, if you're in your 20s, you might be thinking, yeah, but things are much harder than you realize. It's hard to get on the property ladder. There's all sorts of pressures. This is all true, but if you take the long-term view, we really do enjoy access to technology, experiences, and opportunities far beyond the wildest dreams of the many generations that have gone before us. So what is it that we're missing? What is it we're still missing in our pursuit of happiness? Could it be that we have too much to live with, but not enough to live for? According to Arthur C. Brooks, a professor of psychology, all the best research from the fields of neuroscience as well as social science now says that in addition to meeting all the needs on Maslow's pyramid, including the higher needs for self-esteem and self-actualization, something more is still needed in order for human beings to experience happiness. And that something else, according to neuroscience, is a coherent and overarching sense of the meaning or purpose of life itself. A Jewish psychologist by the name of Viktor Frankl discovered this truth in a concentration camp during World War II. And while contemplating how to survive the immense challenges of this life, hellish life, Frankl began observing his fellow inmates in the hope of finding some secret, some coping mechanism that worked. And he discovered eventually that it was those individuals who could not find a meaning greater than their present sufferings, who gave up, lost hope, and eventually died. On the other hand, it was those individuals who could find a greater purpose to life, hope for the future beyond their present ordeal, who were far more likely to survive. And he wrote a classic work in Western literature called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, he explains that the quest for contentment and satisfaction in life will always fall short if it is limited merely to the project of the self or of self-actualization. He writes, what is called self-actualization is not an attainable aim at all, for the simple reason that the more one would strive for it, the more he would miss it. In other words, self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. Now, a terrific example of this comes from the myriad of stories from Londoners who lived through the Blitz during World War II, and with the existential fear of bombs landing on the roof of your houses. Nonetheless, many describe that as one of the happiest times of their life. How is that possible? Well, because their lives were infused with a sense of purpose greater than themselves. Winston Churchill's private secretary, John Martin, wrote that people came to see themselves as protagonists on a vaster scene and champions of a high and invincible cause for which the stars in their courses were fighting. This is how we are as human beings. The reason we struggle to find happiness, believed the great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, is because each person is a natural egoist. Look at the person next to you. You're looking at a natural egoist. But same goes when you look in the mirror, so don't get too ahead of yourselves. All of us, we're natural egoists, says Tolstoy. Yeah, so don't shoot the messenger. Who says we see the world as if it were a novel in which we were the hero, whereas the truly good life begins when a person can see the world as if he or she were a minor character in someone else's novel. In other words, Tolstoy would say, you need to realize something about life. It's not all about you. There's a bigger story. Now, of course, that sort of thinking flies in the face of much of our popular culture's happiness experts who continue to follow Maslow's theory that once the lower needs are met, happiness is all about meeting our needs for self-fulfillment and self-actualization. But fascinatingly, even though most introductory textbooks in psychology do not mention it, towards the end of his life, Maslow eventually recognized this truth as well. That in order to be happy, we must discover a meaning or purpose to life that is bigger than ourselves. And Maslow called this need the need for self-transcendence, and he placed it at the very top of his pyramid. This inbuilt human need for meaning or purpose greater than ourselves explains why scientists have found that those with a spiritual practice or who follow religious beliefs tend to be happier than those who don't. For example, in Time Magazine's special 2016 edition entitled The Science of Happiness, we read that study after study after study has found that religious people tend to be less depressed overall and less anxious than non-believers overall, on average, and better able to handle the ups and downs of life. Now, of course, many people take the view that a sense of meaning and purpose in life can be found without God, without religion. The British writer Stephen Fry, for example, in an online video entitled How to Be Happy, argues that meaning is not to be found in any sort of divine plan or cosmic purpose to the universe, but rather in the meaning that we create for ourselves, which he says can be in anything we choose, including, for example, a commitment to politics, our career, some artistic endeavor, or just in simple pleasures such as drinking wine with friends or hiking together in nature. However, according to studies such as a 2015 study by researchers at the London School of Economics, the only social activity associated with sustained happiness was participating in a religious organization, even more than volunteering for a charity, taking educational courses, or participating in a political or community organization. And it raises a fascinating question, not just for psychologists, but for any human being, which is, why is that? Well, I want to suggest, as psychologists do as well, it might have something to do with the difference between two different types of meaning that we often get confused by. The first, situational meaning, and the second, global meaning. So social psychologists say situational meaning refers to the meaning that we create for ourselves, that we assign to particular things in life, such as, for example, possessions, our job, our friendships, our artistic hobbies. Whereas a global meaning, on the other hand, is a big picture, comprehensive framework of what the whole of life is all about. And here's the kicker. It's only a global meaning to life that is able to meet the inbuilt human need for self-transcendence, enabling us to experience happiness not just in our lives, but with our lives as a totality, as we live in them, but not just in them, as we live for the bigger story. And according to social psychologist Roy Baumeister, a global meaning is one that can convincingly answer four fundamental human questions. The question of identity, who am I? Value, do I matter? Purpose, why am I here? And agency, can I make a difference? We see this analysis ring true in the fascinating story of Leo Tolstoy, who I mentioned earlier, the great Russian novelist, and his decade-long search for meaning and happiness after he rejected Christianity as a child. First of all, he thought, well, maybe pleasure's the answer, just having a great time. So he partied with the rich and famous, drinking heavily, sleeping around, gambling, and he said, it just didn't satisfy. And then he said, well, maybe money's the answer. He made lots of money from his books. He inherited a large amount from an estate. And he said, no, it just didn't satisfy. And he said, okay, well, maybe celebrity, fame, importance is the answer. He wrote some of the greatest novels in world literature, but still he thought it just doesn't satisfy. And then he says, well, maybe the answer is family life, to give my family the best possible life. He married. He had 13 children. It's not a competition, but hey, he's doing all right. But still, he wasn't satisfied. I'm surprised he wasn't ultimately destroyed, but anyway. So there he was, having achieved all his ambitions and surrounded by what the people in his day considered to be complete happiness, and yet one question drove him to the verge of despair, and the question was this: what meaning has my life that the inevitability of death does not destroy? What meaning has my life that the inevitability of death does not destroy? And the best answer that the brightest minds of his day could give in response to the question was this: in the infinity of space and the infinity of time, infinitely small particles mutate with infinite complexity. That's it. Needless to say, Tolstoy did not find that answer very satisfying. So Tolstoy kept looking and looking until finally he found in the peasant people of Russia the answer he'd been looking for, their faith in God through Jesus Christ. A faith that enabled them to answer the big questions of life satisfactorily, that enabled them to find the one thing that he and his contemporaries had been unable to find, genuine happiness, even in the midst of poverty and pain, a genuine happiness that Tolstoy just couldn't argue against. Tolstoy saw for himself that Christian faith is a faith that works in the real world, time-tested by reality and experience. A faith that explains why our repeated attempts to find lasting happiness in pleasure or money or fame or success ultimately fail, and a faith that satisfactorily answers the four big questions that must be answered in order for life to be comprehensively meaningful. Who am I? Do I matter? Why am I here? Can I make a difference? For according to Christianity, as Tolstoy discovered, your identity, who you are, comes not from what you do or from what you achieve, but from who you are based on whose you are, God's beloved creation. And it says that you really do matter because you are more than just matter. You are a spiritual being, purposely made for an eternal future in God's good universe. And it says your life does have a purpose because you are here with a purpose. You have been made to love and to be loved in relationship with the one from whom love ultimately derives. And it says that your life does make a difference because you were made to make a difference. And that the choices and the decisions and the actions in this life echo not only in this life, but for all eternity. A few years ago, I spent a week speaking to some very successful, financially well-off people in a number of investment banks and consultancy firms in London on some of the big questions of life. And what I found absolutely fascinating was that the same thing came up during question and answer time, which was this feeling, this sentiment that almost everyone had, that at the end of the day, there has to be something more to life than that which this material world has to offer. And I wonder if you've ever experienced a feeling like that. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, called this the secret signature of every human soul. This sense, this longing, this hope for something indescribable, but something beyond that which material things can satisfy. And he argued in his book, Mere Christianity, that this desire is a clue or a pointer towards the existence of something beyond the material world. He writes, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. According to Christianity, we were never meant to live a life in which we are the main character in the story. We were always meant to live in a much bigger story, a much bigger world in God's story and in what he's doing in his world through his son, Jesus Christ. And the fact that we've got this wrong explains why even when we follow all the best advice in books and magazines on how to find happiness, and we eat organic food and stretch and do yoga and avoid bad relationships and breathe meditatively, we still feel as though something important is missing. We still feel an inner restlessness and lack of peace. And it's because those popular prescriptions for a happier life, as helpful as they genuinely are at best only plasters trying to cover over the symptoms, when the real root of the problem is spiritual. It's that our hearts will always be restless until they rest in God. Another way of saying that is humanity cannot live on bread alone. The physical things of this world, says Jesus, are not enough. Because just as the deep hungers of our stomachs can only be satisfied by food, so too the deep hungers of our soul can only be satisfied by God, because doing life in relationship with God is what you were made for. which is why the great Christian thinker Blaise Pascal once observed, there are only three kinds of people: those who seek God and have found him, these are wise and happy; those who seek God and have not yet found him, these are wise and unhappy; and those who live without either seeking God or finding him, and these are both unwise and unhappy. It reminds me of a story by my good Aussie mate Sheridan Voisey, who talks about a lady named Brenda who complained to a psychiatrist that her ambitious pursuits and achievements had left her just feeling empty and discontent inside. And his words back to her were very blunt. He said, "Humans are not designed to be happy, only to survive and reproduce. We're cursed to chase the teasing and elusive butterfly of contentment and not always to capture it." How different Brenda may have felt, observed my friend, if instead of listening to the psychiatrist's nihilistic words, she had instead read the words of King David in Psalm 131, who writes, "My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me, but I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content." Even with all the responsibilities of a king on his shoulders, David had learned how to lay aside his ambitions and concerns, quiet his heart before God, and entrust his life into his hands. And the result, like a weaned child with its mother, he says, "I am content." If we ignore the spiritual dimension to who we are as human beings, then contentment will forever remain an elusive butterfly. But the Bible shows us another way: catching contentment through quietly resting in the presence of God. A contentment that doesn't depend on circumstances or on people, but on the all-sufficient and everlasting love of God, by whom and for whom our hearts were created, which means that it's a contentment that you can have even when you're terribly sad. Because Jesus himself was the most joyous person who ever lived, and yet the Bible also describes him as a man of sorrows, showing us that there is a place both for deep joy and profound sadness in the expanse of God's love for the world. And it's in the expanse of God's love that lasting happiness is ultimately found. According to the Christian faith, there is a deep paradox at the heart of our universe, which is that if you only seek for happiness, you will never find it. But if you seek for God, you'll get happiness thrown in as well. And thankfully, we do not have to seek far, because the Bible says God has already sought us and has revealed himself to us most clearly and most intimately through his dear son, Jesus. As Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Jesus does not promise a life without pain or loss or suffering or disappointment, but he does promise to be with us through all these things and to be in himself, our life, our peace, our consolation, our joy, as we feed spiritually on him. And so in closing, can I ask you this? Are you hungry for satisfaction in the depths of your soul? Are you thirsting for contentment, starving for joy? Then why not come unto God through Jesus Christ and surrender? Or for some of us, it might mean to resurrender unto him all our hopes, ambitions, dreams, and plans, to lay it all at his feet and to say sorry to God for looking to the pleasures or to the accolades of this world to fulfill us or to satisfy our longings for identity or value or purpose or meaning or freedom, when it's only in Christ and Christ alone that the deepest hungers of the human soul can truly be satisfied. If that's you, then why not use the next song that we're about to sing as Cam and Joseph come up to lead us in worship just now, as an opportunity to give to God all your ambitions and concerns, to quiet your heart before him and to entrust your life into his hands, to make that first step towards God or back to God, as the case may be. For the one thing we can all agree is that we all want to be happy. And according to the Bible, the secret of happiness is scandalously simple. For the Christian secret of happiness is simply Jesus. And as we read in the Bible in Revelation 3, verse 20, Jesus says, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and dine with him and he with me. If you sense Jesus knocking on the door of your heart this morning, can I encourage you to use the words of this next song to open your heart to him? For to say yes to Jesus is at the same time to say yes to true and everlasting joy.